Hello, and welcome to my talk on autistic masking and autistic burnout. Thank you for coming to watch me today, and I'm just going to introduce myself. My name is Kieran Rose, and I was diagnosed as autistic in 2003. I am parent to three children, two of whom are diagnosed autistic. I am a published mainstream and academic author, an international public speaker whose essays at theautisticadvocate.com, which you can see below, have been read by over 1.5 million people. I have a background in special educational needs and service delivery for autistic children and adults. I deliver my own specialist training to professionals, parents, carers and autistic people, and provide private consultancy to charities and organisations around the world. I am the co-founder of the networking organisation The Autistic Cooperative. I am senior advisor to the international OT and SLP education organisation, the Therapist Neurodiversity Collective, and I'm also a neurodivergence educator for the US OT charity, the STAR Institute. I've lectured at universities across the UK. I am a peer reviewer for the academic journal Autism in Adulthood. I'm an honorary research associate for the University of Sunderland in the UK and an associate researcher with Grand at University College London. I am currently co-producing research into different areas including autistic masking, victimization and monotropism and autistic identity, and have co-authored published papers on autistic masking and workplace employment for neurodivergent people. That's enough of me, and on with the talk.
Autism was first officially recognized in the 1940s. Hans Asperger and Leo Kanner, with a helping hand from the medical profession and the charity industry, are the founders and writers of the narrative we currently live under. Its roots lie in and remain tied with eugenics, Nazism, and Victorian psychology. Using the framework built by these two men, we've gone on to have a complete misunderstanding and misrepresentation of what autism is, and possibly more importantly, what autism isn't. It's created an autism industry involving charities, universities, pharmaceutical companies, therapists and behaviorists and so on, which worldwide is worth billions of dollars, and a world of services that adds 50% to the price tag when the word sensory is added to it, with barely a penny of any of that ever reaching the pocket of those who need it. This framework has fed into a medical and behavioral model of autism, a model which is implicitly biased towards a so-called male presentation of autism, solely because these 1940s experts and those that followed were biased towards boys. A model upon which research papers are based on the supposed wisdom of all these men. Then research papers are created based upon those research papers. Then research papers are created based upon those research papers. Ergo myth becomes fact. And this fact is presented to the world. Every few years, the writers of this narrative get together and create a diagnostic criteria, which at its heart is crammed full of bias and error. It's mostly the opinions of a bunch of well-paid professionals who egotistically cling onto their theories, which are all built upon a foundation of sand. Proof of this lies in the fact that in 1925, 13 years before Hans Asperger, a Ukrainian researcher called Grunya Sokoreva identified a list, a criteria of what later came to be known as autism. If you hold that list up to the current diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5, it's almost identical. Only in the world of autism can you make 80 years of supposed progress, only to end up 95 years in the past. Around this, society has developed ways of acting, thinking, and doing things based on evolving concepts rooted in historical behaviors. We call these social norms. Alongside this also, society has developed these concepts of what normality, in inverted commas, is, and how people should behave and act. And what has this collectively given the world? Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is literally the process of deciding upon something and using information to reinforce that decision. When we receive information that doesn't align with our preconceived notions, we often exclude it or vehemently reject it. In terms of autism, confirmation bias is informed by the societal and behavioral concepts of autism, many of which are grounded in myths, media stereotypes, and textbooks written by non-autistic people who make external observations, and research based on all those notions. We've been spoon-fed a narrative about autism for so long that we've created an image in our minds. It's become the cultural and societal version of autism, We have an idealized image of what autism looks like. So we see what we expect to see. We expect to see autism present only in white boys or men that are LD or genius or whom behave in a particular way. And all because society has been primed to see it that way by years of people only talking about autism in white boys or men that are LD or genius or who behave in a particular way. So we end up with an extreme narrow view of how autistic people should present, hugely representative in popular culture via films, televisions, books, and the media. We have the traditional boy child version of autism, who screams and melts down and makes parents, particularly mothers, lives a misery. Or we have the party trick white male autistic, exceptionally talented, even savant level talented at one thing, but otherwise ridiculously, even comically socially inept, quirky or learning disabled, in many ways incompetent and Peter Pan like. These concepts circle back into professional thinking. Diagnosticians fall for the same myths and stereotypes and use those to reject diagnoses. Researchers, despite being huge on avoiding bias, base their research on other research that reinforces this thinking. Ergo, their work is flawed from the start. They are literally researching based on something that only exists on paper, viewed through the eyes of behavior. Supports either don't exist or are withheld based on notions of being able to function. Teachers attempt to meet needs by using tick box style checklists designed for autistic children, obviously because all autistic children have exactly the same needs and don't differ in any way. Here, have a visual timetable. Professionals are too often stuck in textbook mode. If you don't act the way you are expected to act, then you don't get identified, diagnosed, or supported. Very few people have the context needed to be able to step back and see the bigger picture, so they rely on and feed their confirmation bias. They see and hear what they want to see and hear based on what they think they know. And all this plays into autistic masking. A little quiz for you to ponder while I talk through this next section. Which of these two images is from the bedroom of an autistic child? Masking sits at the heart of our understanding of autism. It intersects with disability, ethnicity, education, the workplace, society, but none more prevalent at the moment than gender, with the current narrative of gendering autism, particularly with what is being described as the female autism phenotype. Of course, autistic women have different experiences to autistic men, in the same way that autistic people of colour, BAME autistic people, gay autistic people, and so on have different experiences. And in the same way, non-autistic women have different experiences to non-autistic men, and so on. Of course, there are different presentations of autism, because autistic people are individual human beings. Like with all humans, how a person presents is influenced by the nature of each person, their gender, their personality, their upbringing, their race, their religion, their life experiences, their co-occurring conditions too, and the different impact of those different things on different people. Our identities are shaped by those things, but at the heart of it, as a major driver of those identities, our internal experience of what it means to be autistic, how our brains and bodies function, are incredibly similar and relatable. And regardless of the differences I just mentioned, our life stories are usually remarkably similar too. Looking through the eyes of the diagnostic criteria and the current autism narrative, we have the typical presentation of autism, which the criteria attempts to describe and leans to favour white boys. But then we have those who don't really fit that criteria, an atypical type, which the narrative states favours girls. Neither of those things is right, though, as boys can and do regularly present with the atypical type, and girls can present with the typical type. Equally, there are transgender boys and girls, non-binary people, and also intersex people who can present as either too. Society plays a huge part here, with girls in particular, because girls and women are seen through a particular societal lens, with expectations of certain behaviours. When masking plays into those expectations, they are more likely to be missed. It is not the mask or the masker at fault, but the expectations and bias of those viewing the masker. A colleague of mine, Eleanor Broadbent, describes it like this. When boys line up cars or toys or nuts and bolts in a perfect logical order, it's called autism. When girls line up shoes or dolls or stuffed toys in a perfect logical order, it's called good housekeeping. Exactly the same presentation, different social expectations. The idea behind the female autism phenotype is that all autistic women present differently to men because their autistic neurology is completely different autistic neurology, and that women and girls have been missed because they are vastly superior maskers. Of course, it has absolutely nothing to do with flawed understanding, sexism, and research. Autistic women and girls need a huge focus, but not at the risk of replacing one myth with another and then blaming them for it. A much better way of looking at autistic presentations is through the narrative of internalizers and externalizers. Some people lean more to internalizing their being autistic. Other people lean more to externalizing being autistic. Co-occurring conditions play a massive part in this already. If you haven't figured it out already, from the pictures, they're both the bedrooms of autistic children, a boy and a girl. The boys' one is the pink one with the cats, by the way, just to keep your confirmation bias in check. So what does all this have to do with masking? Well, because of all these narratives, the view of autistic people is never shown as the slide, the pictures you can see in front of you. This is why the mask exists. We aren't safe, we're voiceless, and we're unseen, and some more unseen than others. So we now have context as to why the mask occurs, but what exactly is it? Autistic masking is a trauma response, a psychological safety mechanism made up of complex layers of physical, emotional, and social actions, which an autistic person is driven to use to self-protect and present an acceptable version of who they are. This occurs by applying, in fluctuating degrees, often uncontextualized and sometimes rehearsed, learnt behaviors to appropriate situations, while simultaneously suppressing both natural behaviors and self-identity, or conversely projecting an exaggerated identity. All this happens partly consciously, with the person quickly learning to dissociate from the act, and from then on, subconsciously, preemptive, reactive, and unplanned, and all at great mental and physical cost. I've been tinkering with this definition of masking for years. No matter how much I refine it, it stays centered on these points. A trauma response. Project an acceptable version of self and maintain safety. Applying uncontextualized learnt behaviors. Suppressing natural behaviors and identity. Unconscious and conscious. At great cost. The sociologist Irving Goffman nods to the concept of masking in his work. He likens life to a play, with humans as the actors, donning different costumes for different dramatic scenarios. It's a good analogy for life and the adapting we all do in order for those social dynamics to occur. When it comes to autistic masking, things go to far greater extremes. The autistic person is not only the actor in the play, they're also the writer, director, producer, costume designer, makeup artist, ticket seller, and the person who sells you ice cream at the interval. Adaptations to scenarios are tweaks to performances, but fundamentally you are still you. Autistic masking is not you at all. Before we go any further, we need to dispel some myths. What's key to remember here is that masking in the extremes that we're going to talk about is not just reserved for autistic people. How it may display for autistic people and the specific strategies used by autistic people might be unique, but the existence of the mask is across the board for every group that is stigmatized or defined as marginalized. So masking is not just an autistic behavior. Masking is not necessarily about appearing more neurotypical, it's the trauma-fueled projection of an acceptable and expected version of yourself to those around you that keeps you safe. Masking is the fulfillment of confirmation bias, presenting to those around you exactly what they expect to see. Which means that masking is as much about other people as it is the individual. It's about other people's bias and the lenses of ableism, sexism, racism, and narrow and flawed understanding of autism and behavior they look at you through. Masking is a process all autistic people go through regardless of their co-occurring conditions. Masking can also be encouraged through conditioning and compliance. These are examples of the many mechanisms that autistic people can use to engage and uphold the mask. Now, this is based on my own experiences and the experiences of thousands of other autistic people whom I've connected with through the community and who also I've watched and, listened to their conversations. So I'm going to pick out a few, otherwise we'll be here all day. I do whole training sessions on this, but to go through them, we're looking at things like suppression in the extreme, physical suppression, emotional suppression, sensory suppression, suppressing things like pain. Then we look at things like stim redirection or suppression as well. So that's taking stims that you do as a child and holding them in, redirecting them into smaller stims, less noticeable ones, or stopping them altogether, holding yourself still. There's language use here as well, things like scripting and directed echolalia, directed hyperlexia as well, and linguistic masking. There's mirroring other people's behaviors, physical masking, wearing clothes and makeup that cover up who you are or help you project that acceptable other version of you. Things like personality shifting, exaggerating yourself. This is another one. And this is the bit that's always missing from the narrative of masking. So masking has traditionally been seen about hiding and fitting in and not being identified, when in actual fact, there are many autistic people who exaggerate versions of themselves, become more autistic in inverted commas. Remember, it's about people seeing what they expect to see. If they expect to see an autistic person, some people fulfill that prophecy. The whole thing is framed around the suppression of identity and the dissociation that comes with that over time as you age and as you develop. And we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail. There's also aspects about people pleasing and fawning, saying what you think people want you to say, taking on more than you can cope with, saying yes, which then leaves you being easily manipulated and coerced, makes you more likely to be subjected to abuse, more likely to be in a vulnerable situation. Masking has its origins in the earliest of socialization and is rooted in sensory differences. As one example, if you consider an undiagnosed autistic baby, what if that baby finds touch uncomfortable, or worse, has a sensory response of pain upon touch? Babies are put through a constant cycle of touch. They're picked up, put down, wiped, prodded, cuddled, poked. And what's the only way they can communicate that this is hurting them? They cry. So then what happens? They're picked up, put down, wiped, prodded, cuddled, poked. If you continue that cycle, eventually the baby figures out that no matter what it does, the touching is not going to stop. The baby does not become desensitized. It stops reacting in the unconscious hope that the touching will become minimalized. It's suppressing. It protects itself. It complies. It's already learning how to mask. Later, the child is taken to places filled with other babies and toddlers, groups and nursery and preschool. Amidst the sensory overstimulation of this new environment, the child starts to figure out it's not like the other children, that acting in certain ways causes the child to be punished or singled out by the other children, or that other children act in certain ways that get rewarded. The child finds that complaints about the sensory environment lead to dismissal, if they can even be communicated at all. So they start to mirror the others. There's no context to what they're copying. They just know everyone else is acting in a certain way and gets favored for it. Eye contact brings praise no matter how much it hurts. Sitting perfectly still brings praise no matter how much you need to move in order to concentrate, and so on. This carries on. The child arrives at school where social situations become more complex and they're put into social skills groups where they're taught how to fit in and make everyone else comfortable, where the sensory environment is more overstimulating, more painful. The expectation to sit and engage and comply increases, and therefore so does the masking. Adults question the child's behaviors when they're deemed negative or inappropriate, and very quickly the child learns not to display them or to over-display them. The child's often dismissed when they complain things are too loud or that their clothes hurt them, so they stop. They struggle to understand the communication that's going on around them, and nobody learns their way of communicating. The expectations and demands placed on the child rise. They're pushed and they either fail or they mask harder. And if they mask harder, what does the teacher see? The quiet boy or girl, the bookish one who avoids attention, or conversely, the one eager to please, eager to answer. Either way, they're doing what the teacher needs, so they're left to get on. Masking is effectively holding your breath. The regulation you need to occur does not occur, and eventually you have to breathe or pass out. Autistic children and adults live under a constant narrative so subtle you probably don't even realize you're part of it. Broken and fix. We have to hold our breath because of this invalidating narrative. It lives in bringing confirmation bias to the fore, either in applying social norms that are effectively unachievable for autistic people, by demanding communication which is incomprehensible and denying communication methods that work, and by bringing personal bias around sensory information into play. It exists in phrases like, sit still, quiet hands, look at me, eyes to the front please, it's not that bad, you'll get over it, stop making such a fuss. They were smiling, so they must like it. Well, it was okay for me. You don't need that. Stop making that noise. None of those statements take into account the needs and feelings of the individual that's the target of them. In fact, they summarily dismiss their needs or pointedly gaslight the person. I have another example. Laura doesn't like this or that. Now that actually looks like a positive advocation of individual need. But the phrase doesn't like, I've heard it used by so many parents and professionals to describe an autistic person in a sensory response of actual pain. It encourages the dismissal of the individual's needs by downgrading its importance. The irony is that while sitting putting these slides together and thinking about what I wanted to say, I was jigging, hand flapping, bouncing on my chair at times, singing the same line from a song over and over, and regularly had to get up and move around. I'm a 41-year-old man who was diagnosed at 23. My school days were horrific. Even though I knew I needed to do those things at school in order to help me learn and process, I couldn't do them at school because my experience was that I was punished for doing them by both teachers and classmates. I even knew on some level that by not doing them, it made it harder for me to learn. No, I said couldn't do them, not didn't do them. It wasn't a choice. That I do them now is testament to the fact that I recognize what I need to do and do it. I no longer do what I'm told, but it took me nearly 32 years to learn that I was stimming, and what I needed to do was normal and appropriate for me. The word no. Children are never given that option. The invalidation of sensory differences sits alongside how autistic people's communication styles are invalidated, how our behavior is pathologized and constantly termed as negative, and how much of what is done to us, either through specific behavioral therapies, social skills training, or through invalidation and dismissal, is focused on the normalization of the autistic person based on what I and others term neuronormative standards. It's this assumption that there is a right way of doing things because society deems that there is a right way of doing things, based not on any evidence, but simply because that's what people do. The issue with this way of thinking is not only flawed, quite frankly, it's enormously egotistical. Many of our social conventions are geographical and change dependent on where you are in the world. Most of those have evolved beyond their original meanings, to the point where most people can't even tell you why they do them. If your neurology is not built in a way that allows you to do what other people do, but in fact wants you to do things in a very different way, but you're constantly told that what you are doing is wrong, or you are told that your reaction is over the top or unnecessary, or that you'll be all right, or don't be so silly, how would that make you feel? The autistic brain has an interest-driven and problem-solving focus. It has a name, monotropism. But if nobody can give you a good reason as to why you are feeling different or why you have problems in your life, and everyone around you is dismissing your feelings or not recognizing your pain, the only solution to this that you can come up with is that you are the problem, that you are broken in some way. To further back this up, when you turn to the literature, when you look at autism through most mediums, it's solely focused on how autistic people are broken, how we fail to communicate properly, how we don't fit in, how we show challenging behavior, how our thoughts and movements and reactions upset other people, and so on. What this does is hand the autistic person, child and adult, an internal narrative of internalized ableism, a voice which says, you can't do this. You shouldn't be like this. This is your fault. The internal voice we inherit from the world around us is, I'm not good enough. I need to change. I need to improve. I need to get better. I need to stop melting down. I need to stop making mistakes. I need to sit still. I need to listen. I need to work harder at being like everyone else. Why do I get picked on? Why am I the only one in pain? Why am I different? I need to understand better. But nobody understands us. Not really. Broken and fixed. We're expected to meet everyone else's demands and needs, many of which don't even make sense. We're put through social skills training so that we can learn to mask and fit in better with everyone else. We're expected to change, to be better versions of ourselves. So we feel wrong. We turn on ourselves and eat ourselves up. We're not like the other kids, but we should be like all the other kids. And all the adults in our lives reinforce that. Subliminally, we're made to feel that we are burdens to our parents because of the constant battle for support. Autism gets the blame for it, so therefore we take on the blame for it. Invalidation. We're made to feel that we're burdens on society by people that talk only about our deficits and do that right in front of us. How many times has a parent gone for an appointment where they're asked to talk about the challenging behavior, the traits, the embarrassing things their child has said or done? And the child's right there in the room. Invalidation. School. The single biggest trigger in the life of an autistic child, a stimulatory hellhole where constant overwhelm is the only feeling available, where reasonable adjustments have to be written in law after an extended and lengthy process, agreed upon by a wodge of different professionals and are rarely enforced, despite the fact that the child is making hundreds of reasonable adjustments just to be in the building. Invalidation. Yet they're expected to get on, to act like the other kids, to wear the uniform that scratches, to put up with the jostling, the constant barrage of noise, the expectation, the inability to keep up. But then they show challenging behavior. And when they can't take it anymore, their school refuses. It is the child that is constantly framed as the problem. And this is the crux of why the mask exists. This is why our brains take all of this trauma and create a defense mechanism. Because being normal equals safety. Well, what's the issue with all of this? Well, the biggest thing is that there is no normal. It doesn't exist. But the world assigns arbitrary targets and objectives and standards based upon the principle that there is a normal. It's a paradox. How can you be something that doesn't exist? The response to that is the mask. The longer it does its job, the better it gets at doing it. The strategies develop and repeat into the adult world and onward. The more complex the situations and relationships, the harder the mask works. The harder it works, the more suppressed the individual underneath becomes, and the stronger they dissociate from it. And the better it gets, the more resources it steals. Layer upon layer of trauma. Layer upon layer of mask responding to trauma. The amount of monotropic singular focus it takes to achieve the mask is immense. The amount of energy that goes into maintaining it is incredible. And the more complex the mask becomes, the more resources it needs to remain sustainable. The more worn down a person is, then the more likely it is that the mask slips or cracks a little temporarily. An example of this would be for the teachers among you when a parent comes to you and tells you of post-school meltdowns and huge changes in behavior outside of school, when all you see is an angel every day that behaves beautifully, is quiet and does what they're told. A common phrase heard by parents is that a child is fine in school. They aren't fine. They're masking. Teachers usually just don't have the context or the knowledge to see that. This post-school behavior actually has a name. It's called the Coca-Cola effect because it's comparable to opening a bottle of Coke after shaking it vigorously. At home, the masking child either feels safe enough or exhausted to the point where they cannot sustain the mask, so a day's worth of suppression and pent-up emotion comes flooding out. For some children, either through not feeling safe or through the depths of their mask, unleashing is not possible, so it all gets pushed down deep inside. Often those children are the ones that melt down infrequently. Again, the autistic community tend to refer to people like this, people such as myself, as internalizers. We tend to shut down rather than melt down. For those in the BAME and ethnic communities, an additional layer is added. It's generally unsafe for them ever not to mask because of the issues around how members of those communities are viewed in a society where racism is ingrained. Can you imagine the reaction to a 6 foot tall black or indigenous man stimming or melting down publicly? The price paid for a day spent masking is exhaustion. This is sometimes described as social burnout or autism fatigue. You may hear it described about children as parents report they shut down after being around people or in unsafe environments, often burying themselves under blankets, sleeping, or mindlessly staring at tablets. The issue is that this way of recharging isn't sufficient. If you think of it in terms of a mobile phone battery, if you only recharge it in short bursts or try to charge without ever switching the phone off, you damage the battery. It never fully charges, and each time you charge it, the charge holds for less time. If the masking autistic person is not given a sustained and lengthy opportunities to withdraw and not mask, or their needs are continuously not met, then it's likely that they will end up in extreme burnout. As you can see, extreme burnout presents in a vast variety of ways. Sometimes all the signs are present, or some of them are present in different extremes. There are things like increased lethargy, irritability, and anxiety, a huge ramp up in sensory oversensitivity, a massive increase in demand avoidance, diminished ability for the individual to regulate their emotional state, leading to an increase in the severity of their shutdowns or meltdowns, or both, an increase in mental rigidity and narrowing of thinking, which coincides with an increase of brain fog and frustration, an increase in stimming, leading to self-injurious behavior, an increase in digestive issues, headaches and migraine, overtiredness, joint pain, a decrease in verbal communication, a need to withdraw more and more, and no ability to mask any of this. You'll notice similarities with what is called autistic regression. There is a school of thought that what is termed regression, which is described as a loss of skills, is actually autistic burnout, and it's a school of thought I'm a member of. What most people feel is confusion and frustration because of the lack of research into this. Unless they've engaged with the autistic community, they won't even know what's happening to them. This is a phenomenon that has been repeatedly described amongst autistic adults and children for decades, yet because of that lack of research and a complete lack of understanding of autism, masking, and burnout, it's often misdiagnosed as depression. It's only just started to be identified in research. Burnout can lead to depression, certainly, but it's never identified separately by professionals. I'm sure many of you can recognize these symptoms from autistic children you know or have worked with, or have been reported on by parents, or maybe even within your children or you. In fact, any of you that have been around someone who has been termed a school refuser, I would seriously recommend exploring the potential that they may be autistic and that they may be going through a period of autistic burnout and unable to mask anymore. It isn't school refusal. All that does is place the blame on the child. Language matters. Let's place the onus on the real reason. It's school-induced anxiety or school-induced trauma. Because then we can stop blaming parents for being weak, for not having firm boundaries, and stop dismissing as irrational the very real anxiety, terror, and sensory overload experienced by these children, and end the current practice of forcing attendance through flooding. If a teacher or a social worker has work-related stress, they can go and get a sick note for 3 months. When a child has school-induced trauma, they get literally dragged there and expected to stay there. We place expectations on autistic children that we don't even apply to ourselves as adults. And people wonder why masking happens. The model of acceptance is an excellent ideological platform upon which to build support for a masking autistic child or adult. The neurodiversity paradigm, which recognizes the validity of everyone being an individual and some having neurologies that work differently to others. Diversity in social intelligence is a concept built on a study from DART in Edinburgh. It recognizes that communication comes in many varied ways and that all of those ways are equally important and need validation. Specifically, that autistic communication is generally efficient and works well amongst autistic people. It's insisting that autistic people engage in non-autistic styles of communication that cause the problem. And to underpin all of this, the role of Dr. Damien Milton's double empathy problem is so important because, when viewed through the lens of autism, it sets up autistic masking and the attitudes of society to autistic people perfectly. I've been talking about the double empathy problem all through this talk, but it's the first time I've named it. Please do go look it up. This notion that there is one way of doing things and one way of being is wrong, no matter whose perspective you do it from. If you consider the real lack of understanding of what autism actually is and the ignorance that puts a vast array of co-occurring conditions under the umbrella term of autism, the lack of understanding of trauma, the lack of understanding of the sensory system, the lack of understanding of neurology, the research underpinned by decades of mistakes and flaws, but yet everyone who is not autistic is quite happy to categorize us, talk over us, dismiss us, tell us what's wrong with us, and decide how we need to be fixed. It is ironic because we are accused of having no or very little empathy for others, when in truth, others have no or very little empathy for us. They're too busy deciding what we need and ignore us when we say that's not what we need. Recognizing those flaws and the poorly informed historical narrative that feeds them is key because it underpins everything which is wrong. And without that context, you can't ever claim to adequately support an autistic person or meet their needs. Whether that autistic person understands this narrative or not is kind of irrelevant because they still suffer under the weight of it every day, knowing or not. Learning to discriminate between what is useful and what is not useful is utterly key. It's fundamental to learn to evaluate whether a source is coming from a positive and constructive place built around the model of acceptance, or whether it is a reinforcement of stereotypes and or a reinforcement of what society thinks, not what autistic people need. Fitting in is not the answer. Learning to exist in the real world is not the answer. If your neurology dictates that that is not how you can live, then it should be understood, acknowledged, accepted, and others supported to recognize and celebrate the fact that it's okay that you are different to them. Ultimately, it's about validation and the recognition that there is not one way of doing things or even close to a right way of doing things. It's recognizing that our confirmation bias and preconceived notions play not only a huge part in the invalidation of autistic people, but are specifically grounded in the failure to recognize the needs of autistic people from an autistic perspective. Because then, instead of furiously trying to measure us up against neuronormative standards that we cannot meet, or that we try to meet through masking which actively harms us, we can start focusing on a strengths model that recognizes both the positive and negative aspects of our sensory system and looks at how we need to work with that to help us thrive in whatever way that looks for us as individuals. And usually done that's by accepting our monotropic focus and engaging with us for our interests. We need the control and autonomy that is denied us. We need that moment of equity to be achieved and sustained. Our autistic selves need to be looked at with value by others and by us. And maybe one day we can stop having so much trauma inflicted on us that our brains don't feel the need to subconsciously decide that it has to knock out the driver, engage stealth mode, and take part in action that is being shown to have a direct link to the ridiculously high suicide rate of autistic people.